Reading from 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 through 22. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shochoh, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shochoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had an helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. And if he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will I be your servant. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. And Jesus said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren.
But now we come into this great story with David, and I say the Philistine on purpose, because we're going to find as we go through 1 Samuel 17, you would think that this is the story between David and Goliath. But as we read through this chapter, you notice that Goliath by name is only mentioned twice. Okay? So in this chapter, we'll have an opportunity to see that the name Goliath only pops up 2 times. Now you'll never guess, but he's called a Philistine 28 times in this chapter. And that should tell us something, that when we put on the spiritual lens of reading God's word, though in the world's eyes, Goliath was the be-all, end-all of champions, in God's eyes, no, he was just a Philistine. In fact, God makes it a point that when we're looking at who this individual was, this champion, that he's just called the Philistine. And so I encourage you, and sometime maybe today, later, or another time going forward, is take a little color, whatever you have, maybe evil or so, red, whatever the case might be, color in Philistine. And it'll just leap off the page that this is what God is trying to impress upon us. It's like when we see in Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar sees the world's empires as a great image, a warrior fighting. And that's how he views the world's empires. But see, when we get to Daniel 7, God says, no. Those empires are brute, fleshly beasts. And see, that's the dichotomy that we're trying to be led to, is that we can look at the world this way, Nebuchadnezzar or Goliath, or we can look at the world God's way, fleshly beasts or the Philistine. And so we've just looked at the chosen and David being anointed, and now we're going to look at the champion. We're going to look at this Philistine known as Goliath. And how we're going to do this is we're going to try and traverse some of the geography of the Valley of Elah, why it was that this was a great place for this battle to take place for the Israelites. And we're going to see why it was that they were very happy that this battle was going on in the Valley of Elah. Then we're going to look at some of the details which were given about Goliath of Gath, why it was that he had a vested interest in this particular battle, and why it was significant that he was of the town of Gath. Then we're going to look at as David of Bethlehem. Now he is inching closer to this battle as he prepares to step out in front of Israel and win a great victory. We're going to look at some of the characteristics that David exudes, and of course we'll have some exhortations throughout. And you notice in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 17, as often many stories begin this way, it gives us a backdrop, it gives us a where is this story taking place. And so in verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 17, it says, "Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Socoh, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines." So here's sort of a large scope aerial view of where this event is taking place. You see there roughly in the middle in the green, the valley of Elah pitched between Azekah and Socoh. And just keep that the 5 cities of the Philistine Confederation in mind: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and you notice the closest of those cities is the hometown of Goliath. And then just a few reference points: Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and Gibeah. Even bring it down closer, almost as if it were a bird's eye view. Here is the valley of Elah itself, an artist's rendering. And you see there, we're told that in the north, the Israelite army positioned themselves, and then across the brook, the Philistine army positioned themselves. And therefore, if you are taking notes in your margins, some of the meanings there of the words Azekah, Ephes-dammim, Elah, and Socoh. I want you to notice the green area, the valley itself. If you were to say, what animal, shape, does that remind you of? You don't have to voice it audibly, but think in your mind. Do you think of a particular animal that would fit that sort of serpentine, oh, I gave it away, shape? And if you were thinking of perhaps a serpent, you'd be correct. Because see, now the Bible is trying to lift our minds to spiritual thinking. Not only is this a battle between 2 individuals, 2 armies, this is a battle between the spirit and the flesh. And it's going to take place it's going to occur in a place where the serpent is going to be crushed. Now just moving on, here's a satellite image, just to give us a better appreciation of the valley in Elah. There you see the yellow marking, and you see the valleys, the farmlands, the flatlands as it meanders through, and the brook is in there as well. And there in the top right corner of the blue is Israel, and the red being the Philistines. And finally, here's another one just to give us a visual of where we're looking at. The red arrow on the left is what we believe would be the positioning of the Philistine army on the slope on one side of the valley. But if you look closely on the right side, where the blue arrow is, you notice how there is this steep, gradual slope that lifts up on top of a mountain. And it's most likely here that the Israelite army would have positioned themselves. And if I was a soldier in Israel and out walked this behemoth of an individual known as Goliath of Gath, and he positioned himself somewhere in the valley, I would feel very nervous unless I was standing on that mountain slope. If I had to be in that valley, I don't know if the outcome would be positive. And so for Israel, they were very happy that they had this strategic position as Goliath presented himself 40 days with his message, morning and evening, defying Israel and the God of Israel. Now, if you just cast your eyes over verses 1 and 2, just looking down again, you notice it says in verse 1, the Philistines gathered their armies to battle. And then it says in verse 2, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and set themselves in battle array. There's one thing with Saul, and it's this, that he was a reactive individual. So rather than be proactive and go out and do things ahead of time, he would react to certain situations, right? So for example, the garrison in Geba, okay, in 1 Samuel 13, verses 1 to 3. Saul allowed this garrison to stand until his son, Jonathan, said, enough's enough. Armor bearer, let's go. And they scaled the rocks and they took out the garrison in Geba. How about the second one? The people scattering. Saul is there, he's waiting for Samuel to show up, and all of a sudden everyone's scattering. Okay, bring me a lamb. We're going to sacrifice it. Everyone come back. And he's very reactive. He couldn't instill inside of the nation a sense of patience and waiting upon the Lord. Come with me to the third one, which is 1 Samuel 14, just to show an example here of Saul's characteristics. You notice what it says here about Saul tarrying in 1 Samuel 14, verse 1. It says in verse 1, now it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan the son of Saul said unto the young men that bare his armor, come, let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he told not his father. And you notice what it says about Saul in verse 2. It says, Saul tarried in the uttermost part of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. So in verse 1, you have Jonathan say, let us go, and they go. But in verse 2, it says that Saul tarried. You see, Jonathan had a spirit of, let's be proactive, let's get rid of these Philistines, let's fight a battle for God. But with Saul, I'll only move if I have to react to something. And that's not how we want to be in the truth. So, for example, you're looking around your meeting, weeks go by, and you've noticed brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so or family has not been attending. 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Now you could just say, oh, they might be on holiday, they're fine. And that would be a reactive mode of living. Or you could take your roster and invite various individuals in your meeting to lunch or to have a fellowship meal and keep up a conversation talking about the truth one with the other and be proactive. So that if ever a time comes when individuals become apathetic and they want to remove themselves from the ecclesia of God, there's something put in place. There's relationships that they have which are going to help to draw them in. So we always want to be proactive in the truth. We don't want to be reactive. Because oftentimes, if we are a reactive brother or sister, the damage has been done and it is almost hard to repair. Back in 1 Samuel 17, Here's what we find in verse 3. Giving another descriptor of where the Philistines are gathering. It says in verse 3 of 1 Samuel 17, the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. Now, I want you to take note of the words there stood. See, the Philistines are standing across the valley. The Israelites are standing. Who's the only one that's moving? It's in verse 4. Verse 4 says, there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. You can almost imagine, it's like in a boxing ring. Now entering in the blue shorts, Goliath of Gath. And the whole place up in an uproar, right? The announcer making the announcement. And out walks this behemoth of a man into the valley. And his shield bearer in front of him. And this army is standing put. And this army is standing put. And all eyes on both sides are fixed on this towering structure in the middle. It's quite an entrance. And they wanted it this way. The Philistines wanted just the appearance of Goliath to instill fear into the hearts and the minds of Israel. Now it says there in verse 4, we're given his height, Goliath's height. At the end of verse 4 it says 6 cubits and a span. Okay? So a cubit was the length of the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. So if you held up your arm, generally this was accepted as a cubit, okay? And a span was the length of the tip of the thumb to the tip of the pinky. So this is not just a surfer dude symbol. This was actually a biblical reference point for measuring. So this is the span that was used. So there's 6 of these cubits and a span was this. So this is how they marked out the height of the individual. And to put it in our sort of common terms, would you like it in centimeters? Because if we were in Canada, no, you wouldn't. If we were in Canada, it would be in centimeters. But ironically, we do use feet. Goliath, they believe, was 9'9". The Masoretic text has 9'9". The Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, is 6'9", and Josephus says 6'9". But we believe that Goliath, based on our consistent using of the cubits, was 9'9". So you can just imagine, this is sort of the witness lineup, as it were, you know, in the jailhouse. Here's Goliath, this towering structure, 9'9". And then beside him was Saul, who's still shoulders and upward, taller than any other individual in Israel. And then here you have, just for reference point, the size of David. We've positioned him just under 6 feet or so, a young man. So this gives a good visual of what Israel was up against. This was no ordinary individual. This was someone who was known far and wide. He was known, as it says, as the champion. Because you see where it says there in verse 4, it says there went out a champion. And the word means, there in verse 4, the word champion, it means a man of spaces. And it's only ever used in verse 23, where it's rendered the word champion. So if you cast your mind over to verse 23 of 1 Samuel 17, and as David talked with him, behold, there came up the man of spaces. That's what the word champion means. It's only used twice, both of Goliath. And that tells us that he was in a league of his own. He stood amongst no other peers. He was a man of spaces. And the idea is a military term that he would go out into a secluded area and he would battle hand-to-hand combat. That was what he was known for. Now, you'd never guess that Goliath played football, did you? You think Goliath played football? He did. This is Goliath's mugshot here. You notice number 13, the number of rebellion. He chose that number carefully. But here's a little description, a fun description of Goliath. While attending Gath High School, his team won the state football championship 4 years in a row, undefeated. He received a scholarship to Ekron University where he went on to win 4 national championships in NCAA football. His playing weight was 550 pounds, and he stood at a towering 9'9". His teammates named him the Bronze Behemoth. He was drafted first overall in the 1050 BC NFL draft, played for the Philistine Giants, where he won 6 Super Bowls and was named to the Pro Bowl every year. When war broke out, he joined the military, where he immediately became a military hero. As Americans, is that easy to relate to? Okay. I went to school at the Buff State for 3.5 years, and although Buffalo is just a stone's throw over the Niagara River to Canada, I have at least some experience in U.S. cherished history as it comes to football. But just a good way to look at Goliath, the size of this man, make him a real figure, because he was, and help us to appreciate that which Israel was up against. Now I want you to come back with me to 1 Samuel chapter 9. Okay, so we've just been given the descriptor of Goliath. 1 Samuel chapter 9. How about the description of Saul? It says there in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 9, there was a man of Benjamin, verse 1, whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becherath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man and a goodly. And there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his Shechem and upwards, he was higher than any of the people. So when you come back to 1 Samuel chapter 17, just having read the description of Saul, out walks Goliath into the valley. Wow, look how big he is. He's 9'9". I've also seen his highlights on YouTube. He's amazing at football. And immediately Israel would say, well, we have our Goliath. We have the king that we asked for, who would go out and fight our battles like the nations. Saul, go fight him. But Saul was nowhere to be seen. And we're going to find out, rather than Saul stepping forward in faith that God would deliver a great victory that day, he cowered in fear, and he bribed his army with the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, thinking that he could fight the flesh with the flesh. Because Goliath was a man of flesh. Because look what we find in verse 5 of 1 Samuel 17. Instead of Goliath, he had a helmet of brass upon his head. He was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And in verse 6 it said he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. The spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And there one bearing a shield went before him. Now, it'd be helpful to write down the number, but you see, verse 5, he had a helmet of brass, that's 1. A coat of mail, that's 2. Verse 6, he had greaves of brass, that's 3. He had a target of brass between his shoulders, that's 4. Verse 7, he had a staff of his spear, that's 5. And I want you to just come over and look at verse 45. Just look over at verse 45. It says there later on in the chapter, then said David to the Philistine, verse 45, thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. So Goliath also had a sword on his person. Now if you count up the individual pieces of armor that Goliath had on his person, excluding his shield bearer, there's 6 pieces of armor. Okay? So, Goliath had these 6 pieces of armor, as I say, on his person. He was covered in brass, head to foot. He was a man of flesh indeed. And we might just draw out some of the spiritual significance of these pieces of armor. You see, starting at 12 o'clock and going clockwise, his helmet was Goliath's thoughts. The helmet upon his head, his thoughts were fleshly. Okay, then the next piece of armor we had was the coat of mail, which if you work out how heavy it was, 5,000 shekels of brass, about 125 pounds. So anyone, I won't ask, if you know someone here today that is 125 pounds, ask permission first and say, can I lift you up? And if you go and do that, you have just lifted up that 125-pound person, the weight of the coat of mail that was upon Goliath. I can just imagine later on, like after lunch, you just see in the corner someone's doing lifting. Oh, that's pretty heavy. The third thing there at the bottom right that we're told about Goliath was his greaves of brass. And the greaves of brass were the little sort of shin guards that he had, which represented his feet, his actions, the way that he walked. Number 4 is the target of brass. Now, there's a bit of debate over what this was. See, the RV has the target of brass, number 4, as a dart or a javelin. But our KJV has the shield in verse 45 is the same word as target in verse 6. So I suggest to you that it was he had himself his own shield in the event that his shield bearer died. And then there in bottom left, number 5. Number 5 is in reference to the spear. And the weight of this spear was 17 pounds and 15 pounds. Okay? So his spearhead and the weight of it as if it were a weaver's beam, respectively, 17 pounds and 15 pounds. And then finally, it says in verse 45 that he had a sword on him. And we look from the words of the Lord Jesus Christ in number 6. He said to Peter, put up thy sword into his place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. And God willing, we're going to find out that ultimately Goliath's head was cut off with that very sword. Now I want you to look at verse 7. You see where it says in verse 7 about the spear's head, which weighed 600 shekels of iron. I want to give you the 3 dates of the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, if you're taking notes. The Stone Age was from about 4,000 to 3,200 BC. Okay? That was about the Stone Age, 4,000 to 3,200 BC. The Bronze Age, which followed, was from 3,200 to about 1,200 BC. So 3,200 to 1,200 BC. The one that followed the Bronze Age was the Iron Age, which was from 1200 BC to 500 BC. And this event is taking place just before you come to about 1000 BC. Okay? So the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and now they've entered in just freshly into the Iron Age. And you notice what it says in verse 7 about Goliath, that he had the spearhead on his spear was made out of iron. And what that tells us is that Goliath was a master in his weaponry. He had cutting-edge technology. So he wasn't using a stone, he wasn't even using brass. He had the best of the best when it came to his weaponry and his spearhead. And so he presents himself, this fleshly individual, and it says in verse 8, that as he stepped forward into the valley, it says, he stood and cried with the armies of Israel and said unto them, why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and you servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. You notice what Goliath says. You just look on the screen there. He says, choose a man, let him come down to me. And you just have to envision, there is Goliath in the valley floor, and there is speckled throughout all the mountain the army of Israel. And Goliath lifts up his voice and says, choose a man and let him come down to me. And you just imagine, we're the army of Israel, and we are so thankful that he's down there and I'm up here. We know for sure that that was going on in the mind of Saul. And Saul was very happy that he did not have to venture down into that valley to fight Goliath. I want you to come with me just to 1 Samuel chapter 9. Goliath has put forward the request for a man to come fight me, the Philistine. And look what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 9. It says in verse 15 of 1 Samuel 9, "Now the Lord had told Samuel in his ear a day before Saul came, saying," verse 16, "Tomorrow, about this time, I will send thee a man out of the land of Benjamin. Thou shalt anoint him to be captain over my people Israel, that he may save my people Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." So imagine, Samuel greets Saul, he anoints him and says, "The Lord has told me you have one initiative." "What's that, Samuel?" "You're going to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." So now fast forward and come back to 1 Samuel chapter 17. Goliath has come out and he says, "Choose a man who will fight me, the champion of the Philistines." Now, brothers and sisters and young people, if you were Saul, what would you be thinking? Would you be thinking, "Oh, I wish I wasn't king right now"? Or, "Oh, I got a bad back. That fight the other day really took it out of me. Does anyone else want to step up?" And you see what it says in verse 16 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. It says in verse 16, "And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. Now here's a question. What were we doing 40 days ago? Can you remember? Maybe if you sat long and hard, you would think, okay, I did that thing or I had those errands. 40 days, brothers and sisters and young people. And not just once, but did you notice what it said in verse 16? Morning and evening. Now, why did Goliath present himself morning and evening? Well, you might like to take a note, but in Exodus 29 and verse 39, that was in the law where it said the priest had to offer a lamb morning and evening. Okay, so Exodus 29 and verse 39. I submit to you that Goliath knew that they were offering a lamb morning and evening. I submit to you that reason because in these days, champion fighters, they did their homework, right? Rabshakeh, when he came up to the walls of Jerusalem, he knew all the gods of the lands that he had conquered, and he listed them by name. And he knew that those in the walls of Jerusalem would hear those gods, and they would know, well, what's different between their gods and our gods? And Rabshakeh did his homework in his taunt. And so I think we can rest assured that Goliath did the exact same thing. So you can just imagine Goliath, okay? The battle is about to be set in array, and he's having a chat with the generals. Like, you know, in their law, it says that morning and evening, they're going to be offering a lamb. That's when I should go out and make my taunt. And so you can just imagine Israel offering their lamb. Yahweh, we lift up this lamb to thee, deliver us of our enemies. And in the background is, choose a man that will fight me. And they're trying to offer their prayer to Yahweh. And in the background, who's going to fight me? And then they think, oh, will he ever stop? And then in the evening, Yahweh, deliver thy people Israel. Will you choose a man that will fight me? Day and night, 40 days. Well, I think Goliath chose the right time to instill in Israel the fear that he wanted before the battle had even begun. You know what's amazing about that tactic is confidence is contagious. But so is lack of confidence. And think about it in your own lives. If you've ever been around someone who has confidence, whether at work, school, whatever the case might be. Oh, I'm really worried about this test. No, if you study, you'll do well. Let's study together. Or I have a business meeting coming up and I don't really feel ready about No, let's work together. We'll go over the numbers together. Let's do it together. And that can instill confidence in you. In the ecclesia, let's look at this chapter in the Bible and let's try and take spiritual principles out of it. Let's do it together. Confidence. Well, think about it on the other extreme. You're already lacking in confidence and you surround yourself with other people who are, yeah, you know what, that test, we're going to bomb it. That presentation, we'll probably get fired over it. That chapter in the Bible is too hard. No one can understand it. So who we surround ourselves with is going to rub off on ourselves. Young people here today, let's go CYC this Friday. Good idea. Hang out with that person. Oh, there's this new movie coming out. You got to see it. It's only coming out on this Friday, first night. We got to be there. Or the brothers and sisters. What did you read about in the readings the other day? Oh, I was reading about this story with the kings. A lovely story. Oh, so was I. Or, well, what did you read about in the readings the other day? Oh, I didn't do them. It's a really nice day today. You know, brothers and sisters, we know those experiences because we live those experiences every single day. And see, in the army of Israel, you had everyone looking to their king, and he had no confidence. Not that he was to have confidence in the flesh, but he had no confidence that God would win the victory. And so for 40 days, day and night, the taunt came. And you can just imagine that the prayers that they were lifting up to Yahweh were weightless and empty. Now I want to look at why it was that Goliath had a hatred towards Israel. And here's just two events in the history of Gath, which would have spurned on Goliath like an angry bull against Israel. This was a personal vendetta for him. He was out to win. You see there, number one, there was a catastrophe in Gath that involved where almost the whole city was succumbed to disease. And then later on in 1 Samuel 7, verses 13 to 14, the whole city was basically conquered. And so Gath had a special spot in Goliath's heart, and he had a personal hatred towards Israel. And so in verse 9, Goliath, he continues his taunt. He says, choose a man, verse 9, if he be able to fight with me and kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. I defy the armies of Israel this day. Verse 10. I defame, or I strip naked the armies of Israel this day. That's what Goliath was saying. You're worthless, Philistines. Or the Philistines say to the Israelites, I defame or strip naked. You see what it says in verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The word there in verse 11, dismayed, it means to break down. They had a nervous breakdown. They're on the slope in the valley of Elah. They had a nervous breakdown. What are we going to do? Who's going to fight? All hoping that someone else would step forward. Have you ever been in this situation where someone asks a question, okay? And you think you know the answer, but you're so shy that you might get it wrong. You don't want to just voice the answer. You're sort of sitting there, right? Perhaps you think back to your days in class. We've all perhaps gone through that experience. Everyone in Israel knew what should be done, didn't they? But no one wanted to step out and go do it. No one wanted to fight the battle for Yahweh. As though they're all nervous, even though they knew the right answer. They knew that something had to be done. They just couldn't do it. Now look what it says in verse 12. It's at this point in 1 Samuel chapter 17, when everyone's having a nervous breakdown, everyone's frozen. It's almost like God, in his spiritual pen, drops in a turning point. You see what it says in verse 12. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. It's almost like here's now entering into the arena, as it were, in the spiritual record. God is going to make a provision, and that's important. Because left up to the flesh, nothing could be done. It was only until God provided a Savior that then the battle could be won. And it says in verse 13, that the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle, and here are their names. The names of the 3 sons that went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next unto him Abinadab, and third Shammah. Now just have a look at the meanings of their names. Okay? So you have Eliab. We were told that he was of a high stature, beautiful countenance. His name means God of his father. So you think he's a tall individual. He represents the God of his father in name. You think that he would stand out and he would say, "Nuh-uh. Someone's defying Israel, I will step out and do it." Doesn't do it. How about Abinadab, the second, father of generosity? God will be generous in the victory. He will provide the way. This is what his name stood for. Nope. I like this third one. You can just imagine he's sort of that sort of rough and tumble sort of son of, usually there's one in every family, if you have enough boys, that is. Perhaps even sometimes girls. But Shammah, his name is to ruin and to devastate. And just imagine that was his passion. He just loved to be in a good tussle. Nope, not him either. But then it says in verse 14, and David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. Twice there in verse 13 and verse 14, we're told that these 3 boys followed Saul. Now, the Bible speaks to us of having role models, mentors, elders, looking to that generation that's ahead and taking good spiritual examples from them. Okay? And if we happen to be in that generation that is leading the ecclesia, the elders of that ecclesia, for example, we are incumbent upon us to be the example. But let's say you're a young person, okay? Or young in the truth, etc. The Bible is counseling us to find a mentor in the ecclesia. You have a question about something, you go up to them, what do you think about this? Have you ever experienced this difficulty before? Yep. Or I have this issue, can you sort of point me in the right direction? Biblically speaking. Yep. It is so crucial to have that relationship in our ecclesias everywhere. And particularly if the young people here today, if you do not have a mentor in the next generation above you who has shown themselves a pattern of good works, make sure you get one. But you see what we're being told in verse 13 and 14, that these 3 eldest, they took it upon themselves to go and look who they followed. Their mentor was Saul. That's a terrible mentor. Because how can you follow an individual who stands perfectly still? Never develop in the truth. You see, this is what we're being told about these 3 boys. But you see what it says in verse 15. Oh, I love this about David. You see what it says in verse 15. So David, he had been anointed and brought into the confines of Saul's palace. It says in verse 15, David, he went and he returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Imagine for a moment, Samuel has just come, he's anointed you. By all intents and purposes, you're to be the next king of Israel. That's the understanding from your conversation with Samuel. You're brought into the palace of Saul. You're given a task to sort of soothe his spirit. Wouldn't you think you're pretty good? Oh, yeah. just been anointed by the greatest prophet in our land. I'm rubbing elbows with the king. I'm playing the harp. I'm skillful. I'm beautiful. Don't you think that would be a temptation for David? But verse 15 says, he went, he returned from Saul, he went back out into an obscure land where no one was around, and he looked after these little sheep. Now, if that doesn't preach humility, I don't know what will. You see, David was not proud in the least. He said, oh, I could take up a spirit of pride, but you know what? No, God wants us to be humble. I always remember when I first went to university, you spend a year there, etc., and you do all the studies that you have, and you come home. And I remember returning my first year in university, I kind of felt like a man. I was on my own for a little bit. I had to cook my meals, do my laundry. I felt independent. So I come into my house, hey, Dad, I borrow the keys, thank you. I can make my own decisions. I'm going to go out. Yep. And you know what happened? I'd come home on the weekend, Friday night, wake up Saturday morning, there'd be a mop bucket at the end of the stairs. My room is in the basement, so I come up, I bypass the mop bucket. Oh, that looks interesting. And my dad, sitting at the table, he'd say, oh, it's Saturday. This is in the summertime. We had a big grass. I'll tell you what, Jess, if you cut the grass first before your brothers, you can do the front, which was easier. And they can do the back, which was bigger. I said, Dad, I go to university now. I don't cut grass. Come on. I did that one time. Because then my dad instilled in me that said, you know what, Jess, if you cut that grass, I don't have to. And something clicked. You think, wow, if I do something for my dad, I'm helping my dad. And very soon, as I got back from university, he says, yeah, you are maturing and you're growing up, etc., but you still live here. And the same thing's with David. David didn't come back from Saul's palace and say, hey, Dad, well, you still got those sheep, cool. That's so yesterday. I'm playing for the king now. He didn't do that. And I tell you, brothers and sisters and young people, when we are in the ecclesia, there is no task too small for us to do. Jesus, when he sent out his disciples, he said, you're going to heal the lame, give sight to the blind, etc. You're going to heal all these people. You're going to radically transform their lives. And at the very end of the chapter, he says, but if you give a cup of cold water, it's the same thing. And the various roles in the ecclesia, brothers and sisters, we know this. But they're all significant. And none are above our pay scale, as it were. Because we are servants of the Almighty God. Look what it says about David in verse 17. There's some more characteristics about David popping off the screen. It says in verse 17, and Jesse said to David, David comes back from Saul. He's humble in spirit. Verse 17, Jesse said to David, his son, take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren. Now I want you to, if you have a coloring pencil, I highly encourage you to do this. But look, verse 17, at the very end of the verse, Jesse says to David, run to the camp to thy brethren. Okay? Verse 24, David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army. Okay, verse 48. Later on, when David is going out to fight Goliath, it says, and it came to pass, verse 48, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army. And how about this in verse 50? David prevailed over the Philistine with the sling, and in verse 51 it said, and therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine. So here, David shows up at the camp, and everyone's standing around. The Philistine's over there, this pack of flesh is in the middle, and Israelites standing here. And the only ones running to and fro is David. The only one who's active in the truth is David. And it's a good lesson to learn about doing things in the truth. Do it now. Do it with enthusiasm. Get on with the service. And it says in verse 18, Jesse said, "Carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000. Look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge." Okay? The word there, pledge, if you're taking notes, it means the word token of safety. So David was going to deliver the food. He maybe grab an article of clothing from Eliab and from Abinadab and Shammah, and just something that would be familiar to the family. He would bring them back to Jesse and say, "See, they're alive. They're doing well. And they got the food." A token of their safety is what Jesse was asking for. He cared about his sons, as all fathers do. And notice what it says in verse 20 about David, okay? We're going to find out that David was of a young age, middle to late teens, and myself having been one, and if you've ever raised one, you'll know that on a Saturday morning, for example, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, you'll be doing your this and that around the house or whatever. And if you have a teenage, particularly boy, generally speaking, he's probably still sleeping, right? Right? And that's fine to a degree. I mean, you need to have your rest, you're growing, you're maturing, etc. But look, verse 20, David did not do that. It says in verse 20, "And David rose up early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper." Notice, he was responsible. He didn't just, "Oh, sheep, you're off on your own, I'm off for an errand." He left the sheep in the hand of a keeper. He was responsible. He took and went as Jesse had commanded him. So here's another element of his humility. I'm just carrying these loaves, these cheese, but my dad told me to do it. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight and shouted for the battle. David did things right away. I always remember this little story about a teacher and his student. This teacher had a student who was late every single day, okay? We have brothers and sisters in our meeting where you can almost count on, oh yeah, they'll be late. That's just the way they are. That's fine. But this teacher had a student who was late every single day, and each time, long after the bell, the door would open, student would come in, take his place late, disrupt the class. But one day, this student surprised his teacher. He was 5 minutes early. And the teacher was overjoyed, thinking, "Wow, what a transformation." And the teacher said, "You know what, I want to congratulate you. You were 5 minutes early. I'm so proud of you. This is the earliest you've ever been late." And the teacher turns to the student and says, well, what was the reason? He says, "Well, I didn't hit the snooze this morning." And the teacher says, "You didn't hit the snooze this morning? What do you mean?" He says, "Well, every morning when my alarm clock goes off, I hit the snooze." How many of us, brothers and sisters, have a snooze in the truth? We all have a snooze in the truth, don't we? Where time has come to do something, and we think, oh, that's easy option, back to bed. We look at David in verse 20. He rose up early in the morning. David did not have a snooze button. So next time we're waking up, whatever the day might be, you think, oh no, it's time to get up. Time to get going, just like David did. Because you see, brothers, as we develop spiritual habits, and we look at these different individuals, Abraham, looking to see the fare of Lot in his ecclesia there in Sodom and Gomorrah, rose up early to see after the events of the previous night. How about Hannah? Hannah rose up early to lift up her voice to the Lord God. And how about the apostles? In the early ecclesia, they rose up early, as it were. And we looked at what David's character in this chapter, that he was humble. He was caring. He cared about his brethren as well. He was eager, early to do things, and he was responsible because he left the sheep in the care of other individuals. He obeyed his father, though the circumstance of his life might have given him an excuse not to. And lastly, he was willing to work. Because you see what it says in verse 22 about David. David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage. The word there, carriage, in the Hebrew, it's rendered the vessels from upon him. Okay? So David had packed the bread, put the cheese in, etc., etc., the big load, puts it on his shoulder, and he was carrying it all the way to see how his brothers were. He put the responsibility of the care of his brothers and sisters on his shoulders, and he went and did as he was commanded. And he shows up, and the first thing David hears after he's left his food in the hand of the carriage is verse 23. It says that as he talked with them, David, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And for the first time, there was someone new in the camp who heard the taunt of Goliath. And God willing, after we partake of a meal, we'll look at how David responded.